The future of Western civilization. Is there still a bright future for America, or are we screwed? Hello, everyone. I'm Bobtheorc, and today we are once again with our good friend Gator. Gator, you often have an interesting description of what you do for a living. What do you do for a living today?
So I've most recently been taking art classes, and they had a need for nude models. So I am now modeling for
So you're
artists
you're a
within
nude
the
model employed by the federal government to do nude modeling.
exactly. My form is very delicious. I find that really helps with students. So yeah, that's what I do right
All right. Well, um, to be honest, Gator, I have no real concept of what you actually do. I know you're not really allowed to get into too much detail, but you often have really interesting insights on, on history and on just Western civilization in general. And so I thought, given all the weirdness going on, and given the general lack of public confidence in our institutions and our media, etc., I thought that this might be a good opportunity to talk about where Western civilization goes from here, and what's America's role going to be in all this, and do we have a bright future, or are we on the way out?
now. Absolutely, Bob, and it's always fun to talk about these things with you as well. We think our conversations are usually pretty enlightening on my end, and it's always good to sit down and just discuss things with you.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. So I guess let's start broadly, kind of geopolitical. Um, I was speaking with a good friend of mine in Ukraine the other day, and she uh, basically implied that Ukraine's just getting its ass kicked right now, and that's the complete opposite of what we're being told in the media. But apparently, American weapons and assistance aren't reaching Ukraine. Uh, she couldn't get into a lot of details, but from her perspective, uh, it's not going very well. And from talking to some of my other Ukrainian friends, that would be the case that I have, that I've gotten from them as well. The impression I've gotten. Has America lost its ability to project power on the world stage, or maybe we've never had this power for a long time, and now the curtains are finally, opening up to reveal, what we're really at, or is it just that our government is just not making good decisions and we're just wasting what we have? I mean, what's your take on all this?
Well, I mean, the question of whether we can get power, I think, is a good question, and the question is, I think historically looking back, what kind of are we projecting? Why are we projecting that? One thing I think we can't do is kind of what we did during the Korean War and during the Vietnam War. We can't dedicate 100, 200,000 troops, to a peacekeeping mission in any particular country right now. I think many would debate me on it, but I would look back to with the drawdown in Iraq when we went down from 135,000 down to zero overnight. I think that was in 2011 when we did the Obama drawdown. Since then, we were kind of struggling to maintain power in Afghanistan. So you would think at least at the turn of the millennia, a military that was postured to fight two global conflicts simultaneously and then did that, you would think being able to draw down from a single conflict, that we would be able to manage that conflict well. But that did not happen. In fact, we completely withdrew from Afghanistan, and I think it wasn't exactly the best draw from a PR standpoint. I think that's a fair statement to make. So I
Yeah.
think certainly, within the last 20 years, we went from a nation capable of fighting two global conflicts simultaneously to what we're seeing now is where we couldn't manage a single global conflict. And
Well,
that
I,
is
I would I
definitely
would argue that Afghanistan isn't even a global conflict; it's a regional conflict. Any of the
yeah.
wars in the Middle East were also regional conflicts. And our
Uh,
situation in Ukraine, I would say, is quite regional as well. I mean, the fighting's contained.
I'm not going to so much argue with you, and I certainly would. I think there are global interests there, not so much global. And I do think when you're looking at it from a coalition standpoint, you certainly had, Australian forces deployed there. You had some Polish forces deployed, so it was a multinational
Oh, yeah, I see what
effort.
I see what you mean. You're breaking it up just a little bit, so
Yeah,
I may ask you to repeat yourself now and then. I know that you're
that's fine.
you have a weak signal because you're in a secret, undisclosed location. So I appreciate you being available, making time
Absolutely.
out of your busy schedule.
Sure. So was there anything that you wanted me to repeat?
No, I think I heard. So basically, we've gone from a being able to fight two global wars. In World War II, we were fighting both in Europe and in Asia at the same time. And nowadays it seems that we're barely in a position to parry China's expansion in the Pacific, and we're certainly not in any position to deal with Russia's expansion into Ukraine. They're going to call it a special military operation. Biden's going to call it an invasion. I have a unique opinion on that. That probably neither side would agree on. But it seems to me that at least in my lifetime, the American foreign policy has generally been, let's see how much bullshit we can get ourselves into, that we're then not able to finish. Uh, kind of
Yeah,
like the
and
guy that takes three girls out to the bar and then leaves them all stranded.
I'm not going to delve into conspiracy sort of waters when you talk about the Eisenhower comments on the military-industrial conflict, and our what has essentially been a state of constant warfare since the end of World War II. But I do think that America, for the better part of years, was able to sustain a conflict, pretty much constantly throughout that time period. And I do think that's kind of what has changed as of the past few years. We at least according to my opinion, many would
Yeah.
disagree with me. We certainly have boots on the ground in Ukraine, and it seems that irregular war style warfare is what we're capable of projecting right now. And that is a drastic change to have happened within 20, 30 years from being a conventional military power capable of operating on foreign soil and be able to conduct two simultaneous operations to basically an insurgent force. I think it's pretty hard for anybody to argue that there hasn't been a degradation in military capability during that time.
Well, if you think about it, starting in the '90s, after America won the Cold War, we started outsourcing all of our manufacturing overseas, and we really gutted our economy, and we've been kind of living on printed money, on borrowed money, and we've sort of created a global financial system that we were in charge of and we were profiting from. And I would argue that when we kicked Russia out of the SWIFT system and Russia kind of went their own separate way, that exposed the weakness of the American House of Cards in our financial system, and the reality is that our economy is probably quite hollow. I used to rag on China for having a hollow economy. They were so dependent on exports, but they had no real raw materials and no real intellectual property other than what they stole. Although it seems to me now that Russia is no longer providing materials to the West, they're now shifting their focus to the East. They're going to provide China with all the materials they need. China's already stolen everybody's intellectual property, and they're at the point now where they can develop their own, perhaps. Uh, Whereas the American, hegemony has been largely built, I think, on a financial system that makes everybody use our currency, use our money, and dependent on American infrastructure, American logistics. But I see that changing, and that's I'm not sure if America is going to be able to sort itself out in time, or if this is going to be just a slow rolling disaster that we can't stop.
You know, um, yeah, I definitely think it can be turned around if we need to turn it around. Without necessarily being too partisan here, I do think one thing that you can definitely state positively about the Trump presidency, and I'm not going to go into the rest of it, but we did have some very large quarters, large years, increases in our gross domestic, and that is what we would need to get back online. Now, really, since the implementation of NAFTA, and people forget that NAFTA was very bipartisan. It was a law that I believe was initially
You
brokered
broke up
between
again. Are you talking about NAFTA?
NAFTA, yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to like say 1991, NAFTA was brokered under a Republican administration and then signed into law under a Democratic
Yeah.
administration. So very much bipartisan, but really once you started essentially outsourcing entire industries to Mexico and even to Canada, a lot of our automobiles started being made in Canada. That really set the precedent for really exporting American manufacturing. And that to me, I think you do need a solid manufacturing base in your economy. I think the notion of information-based economy and all, even going back to the 80s, the book's Future Shock, it hasn't panned out. You
Yeah.
need to produce something. You need to produce a good or a commodity, something that can be sold on the
Well,
world
and
level
and
in order to be relevant.
and regarding the Trump economy, I've been critical about Trump on certain issues, but one thing I think that he understood, or at least the Trump plan, was ostensibly the only way to get ourselves out of debt and solve the inflation problem is you've got to grow the economy faster than the money's being printed. And because America's in so much debt, we can't stop printing money. We have to print the money to pay the debt. And so the only way to get out of this mess was to bring manufacturing back to America and explode the economy, just grow it at a record pace. And that had a lot of consequences. Uh, but I think in that regard, that strategy is probably the only feasible way of getting us out of our mess. Because Americans won't put up with European style austerity. That's not going to ever happen. People would revolt. And if we can't print the unlimited amount of
Yeah,
money, the federal government would collapse. And I don't think that the federal government has the discipline to stop wasting money at historic rates. So, yeah, the only way to do it would be to deregulate, grow the economy, and bring back manufacturing. But I don't know if, with very few people in the government were on board with that. And certainly now that trend has gone back to business as usual, outsourcing things. I don't, I don't,
yeah.
I think the globalists are probably back in charge. Uh, and so yeah, I think you're right. I think that could be brought back. Although, they say that the Republicans are going to sweep it in 2022. Although I think the Republicans are going to do what Republicans always do, which is nothing. Um,
Well, so let me jump in there, right? A couple of things right there. So first of all, regarding Republican sweeping in 22, I think if you look at the Alabama, and I have some friends and have some interest in it, if you look at what the Alabama GOP is, I think that is sort of a template for a Republican sweep on it's coming. Whereas most of your major, GOP party officials in that state actually started on the Democrat Party, so they are ostensibly the same person. They have the same interests. They have
yeah,
the
well,
same
there's
values.
I've seen very
Yeah,
little difference between the Democrats and Republicans in practice. I mean, on paper they
right.
say different things and they argue on TV, but I think once they get elected, I think there's functionally very little difference between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, for example.
Yeah, and even though the Republicans in California, there are a few Democrats that have jumped ship and are now, in the GOP. Are they a different candidate? Is the GOP sweeping, or are we just rebranding a few of you moderate Democrats? Because America is by and large in general. So,
Yeah,
you know, even if the Republicans quote sweep the elections in 2022,
I don't think
I really don't think yeah,
Yeah, I
it
don't. Th-
doesn't
I
change.
don't think a lot's going to change, and I think we're going to say still have largely the same neocons and largely the same idiots running the show.
Yeah,
There's a few good ones, but I think by and
but let me
large,
let me double back. I think we're in violent agreement, but let me double back to a statement you
yeah,
made. It had to do with financial, bringing back manufacturing
yeah.
in order to solidify the economy. So I think the first point I wanted to make,
And you just
I
totally
had to
you
put,
cut out. You cut out. You'll have to repeat that.
so the first point I wanted to make, and I kind of wanted to, my friend in the financial industry, and this was 2017, 2017, 2018. I remember I said, it's possible we could get about 4 to 5% GDP growth in that year. And he laughed at me and said, there's no way we'd get 3%. He ended up getting 7%. So one thing that I think needs to be stressed is that the model worked. The Trump model worked, at least as far as boosting
And I
industry,
and I
boosting.
think that if I think that Peter Navarro was probably the architect behind the deregulation ideas. I think he was the because he's an economist. I think Trump's a business guy, and I think there are lots of different opinions as to how good Trump actually is at business. But from listening to Peter Navarro, I think he probably is solid as far as his he and my dad would probably agree on a lot of things economically. Dad's always talked about needing to just get the federal government out of the way so that people can get back to making a strong economy.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. Like, I don't think it's necessarily giving Trump credit here. I'm just saying what happened during that time frame, was unparalleled economic
Yeah,
expansion, and that is what we need to get back on
yeah,
track.
and
And
I think that if Biden had gone into office and just simply not done anything, I think we would still be seeing that record growth.
absolutely, and also going back to another thing you said, it seems that we are back in the post-Trump years for whatever reason. We're going back to business as normal from a global economy standpoint.
Yeah,
I also wanted to, I think that's a great point to juxtapose with, going back to 1981, 1992, with the original acceptance and of the NAFTA treaty. That was a bipartisan thing. Everybody was absolutely on board with it at the time. So I do find it curious, and I think your average American, regardless of whether you're Democrat or Republican, needs to look at those 2 points in time, like 1981, 1982, and ask some very hard questions. That a very poor economic policy was adopted with almost universal bipartisan acceptance,
yeah.
while you have proven economic policies that have been almost universally rejected by both parties. I'm not going to speculate as to what it is, but I think these
Well, I'll
reflect
flat out say
really.
because the people in charge are getting their buddies rich. There's a lot of money to be made for selling out an economy. You can fire sale the American economy, and people can loot and pillage the hard work of the average Americans. And for a long time, I think, for most of American history, we focused on being resource independent, manufacturing independent, because, especially in the early days, not a lot of the European powers liked us very much, and we were kind of the redheaded stepchild of the world, and everybody wanted to see us fail. And it wasn't until we saved, Europe's ass in World War II. Um, I think that Russia largely held its own. I mean, we sent them a lot of manufactured goods to help them out. Uh, but so I think they would have probably, done all right with or without us. But France was
Oh,
screwed. Britain, was
no,
having a lot of trouble, and Russia needed a lot of supplies. But we basically financially outproduced the entire world, both all the allies and all the Axis combined in World War II, and that's when we emerged as the economic juggernaut. But the reason we could do that was we were energy independent, we were manufacturing independent, we produced all of our own critical strategic resources. And nowadays, look at the shit show with COVID, where
right.
we were dependent on Chinese for stuff. And I think, right now, if we were to fight in an actual real hot war, let's say China took over Taiwan, and all of a sudden we can't get processors for our technology, we'd be screwed.
So there's two things I want to comment on. First of all, I might, and this isn't the time, but I do think Russia would have been in serious trouble in the United States. I think they had the raw material, but the technology they didn't. You can't fight the Luftwaffe with biplanes, which is what they were trying to do. So
I thought they
raw
had
materials
I
they
thought they
had, but the
had I thought they
manufacturing
had
tech
okayish fighters, but I don't.
Yeah, I'd have to go back. I do know that the biggest fighter that they had was basically a P-51 Maverick. That's where I say that, when you start the war off with the Antonov 2, and then you end it with basically a reverse engineered P-51 Mustang, and, to me, that tells me that you have the raw materials, but your government and your economy isn't managed in such a
Right.
manner that you can actually put
Because
that
I
to
because I
use.
know
And
the
I
tanks
do think
they
without the United States,
yeah, I know the
like,
tanks they'd built themselves because the Germans were doing their tank research in Russia to bypass the treaty restrictions, and so they there was a lot of technology sharing tank wise between the Russian and German tanks
yeah,
pre-war, I think. But
yeah,
But yeah,
Yeah,
that's a little bit off topic.
and that for me, like, and again, but that does segue, I think, into a better topic. Does China have the ability to fill the void that the United States could ostensibly leave behind? If you buy into the notion that it has been American technology, American engineering, and American manufacturing expertise that has sort of fueled a global hegemony post World War II, then I think you have to ask yourself, if that goes away, who fills that void, and can that be China? Right now, I think that's a great question, because I do think to some extent people have overestimated the threat that China
Well,
maintains.
I know that
Sure,
China has trouble building jet engines, that their jet engines are crap, and that and
absolutely.
I think they buy Russian jet engines for all their advanced fighters.
That's true. I'd have to pull up, I'd have to do a couple of Google searches. But I do know that at least I think it's the JL-20, that fighter that looks pretty much like an F-22 knockoff.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're having to use Russian engines in it. They haven't been able to build a fighter. I think the JL, what's it, 13 or 14 was the one where they tried to put indigenous engines in that, it just didn't work.
yeah.
So yeah, I think when you come into technology, China is basically behind, a lot of countries in the world when it comes to high technology in manufacturing,
You're
especially
cutting out again.
when you look at the semiconductor. So what was the last part that I
You're
was
talking about how
lagging
they're
behind?
lagging behind in the technology, and then you cut out.
Yeah. Okay, so and especially when you're looking at how China is lagging behind in technology, and if you look at the semiconductor sort of market, Taiwan Semiconductor is using machines, foundry machines that are being built in Switzerland, and they've basically cornered the global market with 93% of the semiconductor production.
Right.
You know, China hasn't even been able to come close to that, and I think that's where I think you have to look at what kind of threat does China truly pose. I mean, if you're taking knockoff fighters that are needing Russian technologies in order to maintain fifth generation fighter status, you're not really a technology threat to them. Sure,
Yeah.
you are an economic because you can bring a ton of cheap labor to bear because you have slave labor policies among your workforce and among the population. But are you able to truly drive the world economy? Are you able to drive world growth? And I think that's the number one ray of hope as far as the United States being able to maintain its position in the world. There really isn't anybody that can replace us.
That's true. I mean, I think that even if we lose our financial markets, I think we're going to lose the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I think you're going to see the world kind of fracture into several different dominant currencies, and I don't know if it's going to be the Chinese yuan. I think that the Russian ruble is going to be very strong because they're tying it to a basket of their commodities. I think the dollar will still maintain some strength, just because the West will still rely on it. Um, but I don't see the East being dependent. I know that China was talking with Saudi Arabia about buying oil in either the ruble or the yuan. Uh, and because I know the
I'm pretty
Saudis have
sure that
lost.
was the one because there
Yeah.
was
But I
yeah,
know
no,
that
there
the
was a huge debate as to whether.
sorry, you keep cutting out there. Uh,
Sorry, man, go ahead.
yeah, no, I know there was a debate about what currency to use. But generally the Saudis had lost faith in the dollar, and when America started seizing Russian assets, I think the Saudis were concerned that that could happen to them someday because let's face it, the Saudis do some kind of authoritarian stuff sometimes. They are a monarchy.
So,
So
so that absolutely brings up a great point, and that's one player that we don't take enough account of in the world economy is Saudi Arabia. I think when you look at especially the Trump presidency, another thing he did pretty well brokering deals with the Saudi Arabian. I do think Prince Sultan bin Salman becoming the crown prince. It's almost unheard of for a 29-year-old to be second in line to the throne.
right.
It always went from brother to brother. But
Yeah, but I
that
think that
definitely
nobody really
bolstered the
liked Prince
petrodollar.
Alawite or any of those guys.
I'd agree with that too. Regardless, though, there's a really solid relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States,
Yeah.
and that led to a strengthening of the petrodollar. Now, when you have whether, and again, whether you agree with Saudi Arabia and Trump or not, I certainly have issues with Saudi Arabia. When you have a president that kind of moves away from, then you have the opportunity for Saudi Arabia to now side with China and usher in a world where you have the petro yuan as the world's reserve currency. So there is a lot that Saudi Arabia has to say, and I do think one thing that we as Americans need to do is we need to manage the relationship with Saudi Arabia better going forward, because that is one of the things that is going to bolster our
Well,
ability
I
to
mean,
go on the
there's a
world.
reason that when Trump became president, that the Saudi king was the first guy that Trump met with,
Absolutely.
and because I think whatever deal they worked out, when did they work out the petrodollar deal? Was that after World War II? Or was that in the 70s?
You got me on that one.
But whenever they worked out that deal, that we would basically protect the Saudi monarchy, and they would only do business in dollars to guarantee our hegemony. That deal kind of shaped the world structure for the next century. Essentially, as long as that maintains itself, as long as the world is dependent on fossil fuels, the petrodollar will reign supreme. And maybe that's why a lot of these well, that's probably why a lot of these countries are trying to set up parallel energy systems, and I have a feeling the Saudis don't have as much oil as they claim. Because they're moving into other markets, shipping and technology and other things. But
So on that point, I'd slightly disagree with you. I think the shift into finance and you know, finance and like energy technology, alternative energies, that was necessitated by a very low price of oil that you saw about 5, 6 years ago. People tend to forget that once the United States flooded essentially the world market with our domestically produced oil, it really knocked the price of oil down. I mean, you were seeing, at least in America, $1.50 a gallon for the
yeah,
gas. And when you compare it right now to like $6 a gallon, you definitely saw that the primary, at least export that Saudi Arabia brought to bear in the world market was all of a sudden, not worth a lot.
right.
So
Because if
it's going to
because if America actually decides to produce energy, we can dwarf the world.
absolutely,
Uh, we even Russia. I mean, and that's the other thing I never understood. If Biden were serious about taking out the Russian economy, instead of sanctioning Russia and letting them become way stronger, he could have just followed the Saudi Arabian policy of flooding the world with oil. Because I remember a while back the Saudis got pissed at the Russians over something. They flooded the market with oil, and it nearly took out the Russian economy when the price of oil and gas dropped.
yeah. And I would even go so far as to say that the same, I would call what Trump brokered in Saudi Arabia in 2017 a coup d'etat in Saudi Arabia. It literally upended the crown and the succession of, the king, or King Fahd, all of the kings in the way they're named.
Yeah.
So you had essentially a coup d'etat in Saudi Arabia.
Well, because
And I
not
do,
long after that, a bunch of princes got arrested, didn't they?
oh, absolutely, they were. I'd have to go back to, it
Say
was
that
early.
again. You cut out.
Yeah, absolutely, they were all held captive in the Hilton, and they had to basically swear allegiance to Prince Solomon before they were allowed to leave. It was definitely a coup d'état. It wasn't covered as. I do think, though, you saw like sort of GOP aligning with what happened in post 2017, and then you saw the Democrats who were still aligned with sort of previous power structure in Saudi Arabia. So I do think that's a massive global force that's driving world events right now, where you have the United States, at least the Trump, U.S. foreign policy aligned with the sort of new Saudi Arabian order, and you have the Democratic Party sort of aligned with the status quo in Saudi Arabia. That's definitely affecting world order and world politics. And at some point, we as a nation just need to come up with a consistent bipartisan strategy and policy regarding Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, because I guess it doesn't really matter what the strategy is as long as both sides agree this is what we're going to go forward. Because one of the advantages that more authoritarian countries like China or Russia have over us is they can say this is our 50-year plan. Putin's been doing Putin things for 30 years, and China's been following their plan for 30, 40 years also. And So they stick to the plan and march along, whereas the U.S. every 2 to 4 years we just go one way and the other, and I think that makes foreign countries feel they can't rely on us because Trump was in tight with the Middle East, and then Biden comes in. He has a totally different set of priorities. He's focused back on Europe, and then if Trump or DeSantis, whoever comes in 2024, if because I don't know if Biden's planning on running again, we could see another dramatic shift. And it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with the policies. It's just that because the American policy keeps changing back and forth, that our both our allies feel they can't rely on us, and our enemies feel that all they have to do is just wait till the next guy comes in, and they can achieve their goals. Putin. If you believe the West, that the Western media, that Putin was always planning on taking over Ukraine, and I have some questions about that. But let's say we go with that narrative. All Putin had to do was wait till the bad orange man was gone, and then now Ukraine's back on the buffet menu.
And I'm not going to necessarily argue with that one. I think you definitely see the troop buildups, in 2015 in Ukraine. I mean, it almost looks like Trump's presidency was the one thing that kept that invasion out from happening, like six,
Well,
7 years.
if you believe the what the Russians say, Trump threatened to nuke Moscow.
And I wouldn't put it by. I mean, that's just how Trump plays. Like yeah, and that was one of the positive things about his. People were. I remember, dealing with Kim Jong Un in North Korea. People were criticizing him for being incendiary, but that's what he understands about. Like Trump is a jerk, but those
Yeah,
guys are jerks too. The only way to fight a jerk is with a bigger jerk.
yeah,
And I mean, Obama is not the guy that you want negotiating with Kim Jong Un. He's just not. That's not who Kim Jong Un is. That's not how he thinks. He doesn't think in terms of I need to make peace. He's thinking in terms of how do I maintain power.
yeah,
The same with Putin. You're not gonna win Putin over with flowery language. You're gonna win him over with hard talk. You
yeah.
know, I have the world's greatest military. I have the greatest, cadre of military technology. I'm going to use it on you if you step out of line. That's what Putin understood.
Yeah.
You can make a great argument. That's the reason why the Ukrainian invasion didn't happen 6 years ago. You can also make a great, and I don't think you can even argue this point. That's what led to peace in the Korean Peninsula
Yeah.
that has now been destabilized.
Yeah.
You do need, to some extent, a leader in charge of our nation that understands how to negotiate with other, with other leaders, and not just those that are in Europe. And
I
I would
think
also,
that Obama was probably very good at negotiating with our with nice leaders, with our friends in Europe. I think he got along just fine with
right,
them, and because Trump was a dick, he was good at negotiating with other like-minded
well,
people.
absolutely. And where I was going to go with it, Obama was great at negotiating with NATO. He was great at negotiating with the European Union.
Yeah.
But people that don't think like that, he wasn't very good at. And
Yeah.
I think that same criticism can be levied towards Trump.
Yeah, I think
Trump was
Trump had no idea how to deal with Europe.
Well, right, and I think when you look at some of the initial meetings with Merkel, or like Macron, or even Trudeau, Trump was doing the hyper aggressive body language thing. It wasn't playing well.
Yeah.
So what would be awesome, what would be ideal, is if some point in our future we find a way to take the two extremes and blend them into a middle ground again.
Well,
Because you do, yeah. Go ahead.
well, as I say, ideally you have an ambassador to each country that is of the appropriate personality, for that to get along with that country. Unfortunately, at least from my observations, and maybe you have some insight on this, it seems that all of our ambassadors and all of our, basically our State Department is nothing but a bunch of pussies.
You
And
know, I have heard, and I'm not going to say how I know this, but I've heard rumors that the State Department is a very left-leaning organization, and I think that's a great point you bring up. When you have an organization that is monolithically, sort of liberal or progressive, it's very hard for them to function in a diplomatic standpoint
right,
because they can't negotiate
I
peacefully.
think they don't. Yeah, they if you send a progressive to Germany, which is also a very progressive country, I think they'll get along just fine. But if you send a progressive to Saudi Arabia, they're going to be like, fuck you. We throw gay people off of buildings.
And great point. Like I've spent some time in the Middle East. That is a way that they think.
Yeah.
You need to step into the Middle Eastern mindset. They aren't Americans. Like they have no problems beheading people. They have no problems
Yeah.
stoning people. If you're a woman and you are not in the company of man, you will get sexually assaulted on the streets. You're considered fair game.
And it's considered the woman's
You
fault
know,
there, isn't it?
absolutely. And that is why, like, even when I was in those countries, some of my female, colleagues, like, you had to really stress that you're not an American anymore, and that America is a really nice place. And I'm not defending this. I think it's horrible. I'm very proud of the United States, and I'm very proud of the Western world and our values and how we treat women. And I want my daughter to be treated. But you also have to be realistic and pragmatic. And when you're like in Saudi Arabia, when you're in Jordan, this is how you're going to be treated,
Yeah.
and you need to modify your behavior and not put yourself in a bad situation.
Well, I
You,
was,
yeah, go ahead.
or no, I remember I was speaking to a Pakistani, I guess he's sort of a tribal leader, who bounces between Pakistan and the United States. He has his daughter goes to school in Oklahoma because he didn't want her growing up in Pakistan, and so he'd bounce back and forth. And he happened to be a customer of mine and a friend of mine, and he invited me to come to Pakistan with him sometime, and then he said, by the way, when you're in Pakistan, don't look at any women. If you look at a woman who's not yours, they'll kill you. And I'm like,
Absolutely.
holy shit. Um,
And just to give you an example, I was in Egypt. I was visiting the pyramids, and for me, like whenever I see a family trying to take photos, I'm gonna offer to help them. I'm like, hey, you want to take a photo? So I go up to this family and I'll say like, خذ صور, هل تريد خذ صور? I'm speaking terrible Arabic,
yeah,
but I'm trying to say they were terrified like of what I was about to do with them. And
yeah,
I realized, oh, it's not appropriate. And then at that point, I redirected myself into man, and we were cool. I took a picture. Everybody's happy.
yeah,
But that's an example of a basic cultural thing that if you have a State Department that is full of Ivy League graduates or people that graduated from Stanford, very much left leaning institutions, you can't perform a diplomatic function. You can't function as you're intended to. And that's another thing that really is going back to topic, preventing us from sort of maintaining that hegemony throughout the world is we don't have a diverse enough workforce, especially when it comes to those that are master's degree educated
yeah.
coming out of our
I
universities.
would say that we need to add diversity to our State Department, but not the kind of diversity that they think.
Exactly. I mean, you do need some rednecks. Like you really do in order to like be able. I mean, a guy from the middle of West Virginia or Alabama is who you want to be in the room with the Saudi Arabian ambassador.
Oh yeah, because they're
That's
gonna get on great. Oh, look at all the oil guys.
yeah, and make all sorts of cultural observations or sort of denigrations about people from rural areas, but there is still that mindset throughout the world, and that sort of capability that people from the red states or flyover states, they absolutely need to be embedded within our intelligence agencies and within our governments in order to be able to perform that function.
Yeah. Well, and growing up in New York among some affluent people, I had friends who were quite wealthy who traveled all over the world, yet they'd go from a resort to resort to resort, and so they were always seeing the same thing, and so they just assumed that all these different places were the same as America because these resorts all cater to Americans and Western Europeans. And when I talk about some of my adventures to them, going to because I generally go to shitholes, even when I'm in
Right.
Greece, I'm going to little hole in the wall cafes and going to various other interesting places in Eastern Europe, let's say. Uh, I'm visiting my friends. I'm not going to tourist places. I'm just visiting my gamer friends, and so I'm seeing how real people live. And so when I compare notes with my affluent friends in New York at our class reunions, we have very different experiences, even though we're in the same country.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. It is, and it's just something that we as Americans don't grow up understanding.
yeah,
We just assume everybody thinks like we do, embraces our cultural values. It's just not the case. I mean, there are countries in this like I've been to where I've seen people brains like literally killed for just minor infractions in the streets. Nobody bothered. And that's just the kind of stuff that wouldn't happen. And that's we need to be a little. I wouldn't call it open minded because I don't want that for the United States
I
of
think we
America.
have to be
But
pragmatic about how we
yeah,
approach other countries. And it's like one of the things that I've been trying to explain to people about like the Russia Ukraine thing, for example, and I mentioned that because I've been to both countries and I have friends both in Russia and Ukraine, and I said it from a diplomatic situation, it doesn't really matter who's right and who's wrong. You know, let's not even worry about what's right and wrong. The truth of the matter is that Ukraine is way more important to Russia than it is to America, which means that Russia is willing to sacrifice quite a bit more to have their will imposed on Ukraine compared to what America is willing to do. And so if we engage Russia over the Ukraine debate, we have to understand that the Russians are willing to go all in, and we are not willing to go all in. And this is something I was trying to explain to my Ukrainian friends. You know, they were wondering if America was going to come in and save their asses. Like, no, no, America won't. America will talk a good game, and then when the election comes, everybody's going to be focused on domestic issues. And just like clockwork, you don't hear Ukraine talked about in the media anymore. And it's just like what happened the first time in 2014 when all the bullshit happened. America and NATO and the EU all started up a bunch of trouble in Ukraine, and that gave Putin the in to come in and do his bit of trouble. And then after a little while, America just lost interest, and Russia didn't lose interest.
so and I'm going to go back to a statement that Saddam Hussein made in 1991. He said America is not willing to lose 10,000 people in one. He was right. Fortunately, we didn't have to. Our technological gap and advantage that we had over the Iraqis at that time
Was tremendous.
was tremendous. So we have become, for lack of a better term, lazy. Or not
Yeah.
necessarily lazy, but we've become isolated from the sort of
Well,
consequences.
look at Afghanistan when during the pullout when we lost 13 soldiers and
Yeah.
all of Biden's allies turned on him for a week and really criticized over 13 soldiers, and most non-Western countries, you know, Russia, China, anywhere in the Middle East, they wouldn't blink an eye over 13 soldiers. They wouldn't blink an eye over 1,300 soldiers.
So, and this is, it goes back to another reason why, and I think this is something that you can't sort of just, can't qualify or quantify. Fight. Like, I grew up getting in fights. We are not in, like, right now, we are so worried about being assaulted or anything. But, like, I know what it's like to be hit in the face. Your average person from the middle of Texas knows what it's like to be hit in the face.
Yeah.
They understand sacrifice. We don't. We have an entire, population. I'm not just talking about the young kids like the Zoomers or
Well, you
the
know,
Gen
any of the millennials and even
you know,
half the Gen Xers don't know what it's like to get punched in the face.
and if you don't know how to get punched in the face, you don't know what it's like to lose a
Yeah.
friend, lose a son. This was the reality. Like my grandma lost, a 2-year-old, a Loretta, they named her. She just had to move on. Her
Yeah.
neighbor committed suicide. They saw that person. She found his. She didn't have time to like worry about the emotional consequences of this shit. You moved on. Your brother goes off to war. He dies in World War II. Who cares? That was that mentality, and that is what allowed us to establish American
Yeah.
hegemony. Is we were okay with loss. We were okay with sacrifice. We aren't right now. If you implemented a draft right now, this country would completely and utterly devolve like
Yeah.
into anarchy. For lack,
Well, I mean,
and
I
I
would.
don't think I'm even overstating that.
I
It
mean,
would
yeah,
be anarchy.
I wouldn't go to a draft. Certainly not with the way that things are being run. I wouldn't trust the government to, you know, to send me off to any worthwhile cause. I mean, this isn't World War II anymore. This is just a bunch of people getting rich over bullshit.
Yeah. And that's the one thing that we're not going we can't fight a war if nobody is
Yeah.
afraid of it. They're
But
afraid of our technology. They're not afraid of us though.
yeah, yeah. Well, and by contrast, you know, from speaking to my Ukrainian friends, they're losing something like 500 people a day, and they can't even conceive of the idea of giving up. They will not give up. I don't see any reason why Ukraine will give up, and I don't see any reason why Russia will give up, and they're going to fight it to the end.
So and that's where let's devolve or to go into Ukraine a little
Yeah,
bit. I do think you see vastly different countries. At least historically, Ukraine hasn't been a country.
yeah,
People that are going to debate this, I don't care what you say. There was no Ukraine in 1850.
Yeah,
So
for most of history, it was ostensibly part of the Russian Empire, is my
right,
understanding.
and Putin, when he went in, he never said he wanted to take over Ukraine. He said he wanted autonomy for the two disputed territories, and he wanted to leave the. And I still think that's, the people that I think you're talking with are more of the Western
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Ukrainians.
yeah. This is
Yeah.
the Western Ukrainians who more
These are
align with
people,
Poland.
right? And these are people that historically were like under the Polish-Lithuanian,
Yeah. Now, what's interesting
Commonwealth,
is the Eastern Ukrainians that I know there, they support Putin. I would
and
say,
that's my point.
yeah, probably a
I,
quarter of the Ukrainians I know support Putin in this, and that you don't hear about that in the news.
and that's the notion where that I think people are just completely failing to understand. Historically, this is not a country. The sort of eastern part was more Russian and has always been aligned with
And
Russia.
then,
Even Kiev, I mean, the Rus, where Russia gets their name
right,
from,
came from Kiev.
Kiev and Rus, the original
Yeah,
tribal confederation.
and the
So
western part, Lviv, was part of Poland for most of history.
exactly, and that's where what people don't understand the strategy. Russia isn't going to give up those two provinces because
No,
they're Russian. That's their blood. That's their ethnicity. They're not going to give them. The West, I don't think they care about.
no,
I think
I don't. I think they'll probably take everything up to the Dnieper River. I think they're going to probably take Odessa. Um, I don't know if they're going to go for Kiev or not. I think it depends on. I At first I thought that Ukraine would negotiate, and it was looking that way. And apparently, Western people went over to Ukraine, convinced Zelensky that no, no, we've got your back. You can win this. Fight it to the end. And maybe that happened, maybe that didn't. But for whatever reason, the negotiations broke down. I don't know if there's going to be a negotiated peace at this point. At least not unless Zelensky's willing to give up probably a lot more than he's willing to give up. I think Dnipropetrovsk was originally a Russian city. Kiev was originally Russian. I don't remember where the original borders were, but I mean,
So what we're going to have to get used to is a state of constant conflict in Ukraine, and this isn't going to be over. I mean,
this will be like Northern Ireland, I think.
to an extent, I would more use like North and South Korea maybe as an example.
North and South what?
North and South Korea
Yeah, yeah,
as an
okay,
example,
yeah,
where you definitely have people that are even generations not able to admit that they lost the conflict.
yeah,
So I can see, and even if you look at since 2014, I think of our Yanukovych, I want to say was the one that was aligned with Putin.
yeah,
Once they kicked him out of power, that really was the beginning of hostilities, and the hostilities were consistent going on up until 22,
yeah, yeah. No,
and they really
this war's been going on since 2014. It's just the media stopped reporting it for 8 years.
yeah. So I think the lines, you're definitely going to have, Russia operating in impunity, for the next 20, 30 years in eastern Ukraine. And I definitely think there will be like proxy forces, skirmishes, and hostilities consistent and constant, for the next 30, 40 years. And that's just going to be the
How
course
do
of
you
history.
how do you see the U.S. being involved? Are we going to continue doing little insurgency things, or are we going
I
to
mean,
continue the economic war? Are we going to just give it up?
well,
I don't
what do
I don't
we,
I don't see us sending in troops, like not officially.
we couldn't send in troops. We would, honestly, if we could have, we would have. People are going to debate me.
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion. But economically, what can we do? I mean, here's the one thing that people aren't picking up. 95% of the world's rare earth minerals are going. Once Russia fully takes over eastern Ukraine, 95% of the world's rare earth minerals that you need for microchip production is going to be in the hands of China and Russia. That's
Yeah.
a huge political bargaining chip.
Well,
Oil production. Russia
presumably we have a
controls,
bunch of that up in Alaska also, but I don't think
but we're
that.
not. But they're on federal lands, and we aren't allowed to go after them.
Yeah.
So I agree. We could if we wanted to. We don't. So 95% of the world's rare earth minerals are going to be between China and Russia. What are we going to be able to bring economically to be able to fight an economic war against them? We're
Yeah.
barely holding on to the petrodollar.
Yeah.
And how does this work if we continue reducing domestic oil production over the next 15, 20 years? If we continue adopting, quote, green energies? It's insane.
Well, and all the stuff that we're getting for the green energies are coming from China also. The moment China decides to stop playing ball with us economically, some of the reports I'm hearing is that China's finally achieving a strength to where they feel that they're no longer dependent on America, and they're going to start phasing us out. in favor of trying to secure their foothold over Asia, Africa, and South America. And holy shit, we let them in South America. We need to be focusing on securing our hemisphere. We're going to be having a lot of problems.
It's, but again, it goes back to the Ukraine situation. What does China need from this? What do we have to fight China in an economic war? What do we have to fight Ukraine or Russia in an economic war?
I
We
don't.
don't have anything. We have
We've got our financial system. We already played that card, and Putin called our bluff.
exactly. So we're not going to be able to fight them financially. I don't think we can fight them militarily. We're going to continue to support insurgents, fighting insurgent wars. I do think if you look at Azov, you've definitely seen former American military members embedded in that organization, as well as British SA type of operators, French Foreign Legion. So you're definitely going to see a Western insurgent force operating there. But that's it. We can take pot shots at Putin, and that's a sad state to be in.
Yeah.
If you're the United States of America,
Well,
is
and
we're
my
basically
concern is I was talking about this after the Afghanistan mess, is that when we screwed up in Afghanistan and gave up our multi-billion-dollar air base, which apparently China now controls, that
absolutely
that pretty much we gave the Afghan we gave the Taliban $85 billion worth of equipment, and that was kind of a sign to the world that America's done. And
well,
at
but it's not that we gave them the equipment. Again, it goes back to the mindset, what I would call a liberal mindset. Now, I like liberals. I consider myself very much socially liberal, but you also have to understand who you're dealing with. We came up with this notion that somehow we were going to support and train the Afghan National Army, and that the Afghan National Army was going to be able to fight the Taliban. The
right,
Afghan National Army was already embedded tribally with the Taliban. So when we pulled out, the Afghan National Army just took all of our equipment and handed it over to the Taliban.
yeah,
Because they were smart enough to think, I don't want to die. I'm going to
yeah,
work with them. So this is what we as beyond just economic, beyond politically, from a mindset standpoint, we need to be capable of understanding just fundamental Sun Tzu shit. Know your enemy, understand who your enemy is and how to
yeah.
fight them. We don't have that ability. We don't have that character. We don't have that spine to be able to do that kind of stuff anymore. And
Can
that's what is frustrating.
Can Americans regain that, or have we become so ignorant? I
I
mean,
mean,
Putin was shitting on us pretty bad in his. He had a speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum where he basically said that the only people who believe that the American economic problems are Putin's fault are people who are illiterate, and that what did he say? He said that the Biden supporters lack a primary school education. And I mean, so he was shitting on Biden pretty hard, and
and it's kind of true.
I don't see how we can respond to that because I mean, they called our economic bluff, and we're
So
our economic mess is really of our own making.
I'm going to step back there. So I do disagree with what Putin is saying, in the sense that I don't think it's the illiterate Americans
Well, no, it's the
that are the
educated,
problem.
it's the highly educated Americans that are where they're educated in all the wrong things, and
Right.
I
You
found
can't you can't put a pride flag in front of Vladimir Putin and get him to submit. I
yeah,
mean, you just don't like that. That's what they don't understand. I'm not saying, like, honestly, from a social standpoint, do whatever you want, be whatever way you want. But if you're driving foreign policy based on your personal beliefs, it's not going to work.
right,
If you're
because
if you're
most
number one,
people in the world don't share our values.
and yeah, you're not going to be able to bully somebody into submitting by calling them a racist or a bigot or calling them all the epithets that seem to work in America.
Because they don't give a
You know,
shit.
and I'm not saying that I don't agree with the American way. I'm just saying that you can't freaking do this with world leaders that don't operate on that level.
Right, exactly.
And we, our educated elite, the people that are running our military, the people that are running our government, don't understand. They don't know. They wouldn't know what to do.
Well,
Even
and don't get me wrong, I want to see America succeed. Obviously, my ancestors helped found this country, but my concern is that if we don't wake up and take a pragmatic mindset to how the rest of the world works, the rest of the world isn't really, they're intimidated by our technology. They're intimidated by, our spreading freedom from 30,000 feet, as Maddie likes to put it. But when it comes to, our belief systems, most of the world doesn't share it. Europe to some Western Europe to some extent. Um, but, certainly South America doesn't share it. Africa doesn't share it. Asia certainly doesn't share it. So you've got
I
most of the world's population who have their own way of doing things.
absolutely, man. I can't agree with you more on that. And it's just, if there's one thing I want for my nation, it's not for my nation to change. I like my country. I like who we are. I like the fact that you want to have sex with a guy and you're a guy, you want to be gay, cool. No one's going to bother you. I like the fact that you can live your life as you want. Because I want that freedom for myself.
Right.
I want to be able to live my life as I want. I want my children to be able to live. That's the kind of society in the world that I want. I want to embrace social values. Honestly, even though I have cited a lot of Trump and GOP, I do believe that we are morally, compelled to provide people things like health care. I do believe
Yeah.
in universal health. There are a lot of things that I identify and agree with the Democratic Party. But what I want from my nation is to, you have to maintain your personal strength. If you're going to be gay, if you're going to wave the pride flag, spend some time in the studio with jujitsu, go
Well,
to the dojo, spend some time working out, know how to fight,
what?
be a homosexual, but be a homosexual that can kick some too.
Well, the one of my buddies is a big old gay cowboy. He helped me dig a electrical ditch a couple years ago. Big old farm guy, and I wouldn't want to get on his bad side. He'd tear me up. Something. Speaking of American values, though, one of the interesting things that I don't understand about, and I'm not trying to shit on Biden specifically. I think a lot of the Democrats, a lot of the liberals in general, make this mistake. That they have these liberal values, which I generally agree with. And then they open the borders, and people come swarming in who fundamentally do not share their values. And
Yeah,
they think they're doing it for votes, perhaps, but it's like in recent elections in Texas, all the children of conservative Hispanics all voted Republican because they let in millions of
yeah.
conservatives.
If anybody wants to debate that point, I'd point them to Devin Nunes' congressional district. 2/3 of that district, it's a 1/3 white district. Everything else is pretty much Hispanic and Asian, second generation immigrants. Those
Yeah,
are the hardest Republican districts right now in California,
yeah.
and it's hard for me. Like this is one of the things that it frustrates me about the Democrat Party, and frustrated me about even Hillary's approach to the 2016 election. Just because you're Hispanic doesn't. Yeah,
You
and that's
completely lost you there. You said just
sorry.
because you're Hispanic.
Just because you're Hispanic doesn't mean you're going to vote Democrat.
Yeah.
Just because you're Asian doesn't mean you're going to vote Democrat. And I think they're opening these borders to these just anybody that wants to come, assuming that all of these people that are coming from supporters share American
Well,
values and share values. They don't.
it's like they're letting when they were talking about letting in a lot of Ukrainian refugees into Poland, and I know that there's a lot of Ukrainian refugees coming through the southern border somehow. I'm not sure how they're getting there. And I was joking with some of my Russian friends who were wanting to leave Russia because they had certain disagreements with how things were going, and I said, well, just go to Mexico, come across the border, tell them you're Ukrainian, they'll let you on in. And what they don't realize, the Ukrainians, they're Orthodox Christian. They are not just Orthodox Christian, but they are Russian Orthodox Christian. They are really, really conservative. They make Catholics look like liberals.
Yeah. Or,
And
I know it sounds crazy, but I was in Portland this last week and there's a Pride Festival. You know, and I'm getting my shawarma from a guy who's
you're getting your shawarma from what?
a guy from Iraq.
Yeah.
you know, we're talking about. He's telling me about how much he can't stand all these people at this Pride Festival,
Oh, yeah.
and nobody's picking up on this. Nobody bothers to know that this guy's from Iraq. They don't understand who he's from. They just assume he thinks like they do,
Yeah.
and he doesn't. You're bringing people that are really really extremely conservative over here. Beyond extreme. These are the type of people that are going to change.
Well, and because what a lot of liberals don't realize is that American conservatives, by the rest of the world standard, are really fucking liberal.
Yeah,
Especially nowadays, like modern Republicans who are okay. Like Trump was the first conservative. Conservative. I still don't think he's really that conservative, but
no,
Trump was the first Republican to, openly endorse gay marriage. And he had Peter Thiel be his keynote speaker. Peter Thiel's gay as shit,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and what they don't realize. So the people they're calling conservatives, and I know some pretty conservative people, and not one of them gives a damn about two guys, shacking up. That's considered really fucking liberal by most of the world's standards,
I agree.
and and I think that um, I think that liberals are going to be in for a real culture shock when they try and change the demographics of America and don't realize that they're changing it in a way that they're not going to want.
Exactly. And that is, I know we need to, and that's maybe the final thing that we can talk about tonight is that, when you look at, like, I'm in Portland, it's white people if everywhere, as far as you can see. They're really, it is one of the more, least, at least, diverse demographics in our nation. And it's also one of the most liberal.
Yeah,
And that's what I think white people don't understand is they assume that diversity means our values,
right.
you know, and
And it
what they don't
doesn't.
understand is you're talking about white people values here. You really are. And you look at places like Minnesota, pretty white, pretty liberal. You're looking at a lot of places in America that are pretty much ethnically homogenous, also the most liberal. If you're trying to change that diversity, you're also changing the values, and you're changing it in a way that you don't change it.
Yeah.
So that's something that we are going to have to come to terms with. Do we want diversity or do we want what has traditionally been American values, which are honestly socially liberal
Yeah,
values?
yeah. America's been a
You
socially
know,
liberal place. The founding fathers were socially liberal, and more or less. I mean, it's
yeah,
you can't judge people, from the
it,
18th
it's hard.
century,
It's
but
hard to call a slave owner multicultural, so I don't want to go that
it's
far. I
well,
mean,
yeah. It's like I said, you can't for their time. We can't hold them by modern standards because it's a different world back then.
I'd
But
agree with
but for their time, they were more liberal than their counterparts. You
you. Oh
know,
yeah,
they were
and
certainly more liberal than the British monarchy, for example.
yeah, and even though Britain will
And
claim that they hate slavery, their East Asia companies, their various companies are operating under their government's
we're
charter.
we're basically slaves.
Well, and they continued slavery well into the 20th
Yeah,
century.
yeah,
So, I mean, we really were the first nation to adopt an anti-slavery
yeah.
approach, and we have always been, at least from a diversity, I would argue from a diversity standpoint, we have been at the world's forefront of that.
Well,
And
that's
that's,
because there's no American ethnicity. America's an idea, not a race.
I, I would agree with, yeah, absolutely. And if you're trying to, this is and maybe this is the final thing, you can't tear down the statues of the people that made this place like this. you
Some,
know,
yeah,
you're going to tear down statues of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, tooth and nail for religious diversity.
yeah,
I mean, you can argue that he owned slaves, but also you have to look a little bit. I would encourage anybody to really look into the relationship, and the way that he interacted with, Sally Hemings. Like he went to France with her. She could have stayed there, a free woman. She chose to come. Like he had an entire
the,
quarters within the complex of Monticello just for her. He probably was the first. I don't know. We're probably going
I
into
my understanding is that not all of them, but several of the founding fathers had internal debates where they wanted to figure out a pathway to end slavery. They just weren't sure how to do it because they were creatures of the 18th century. And it's easy to look back nowadays and say, "Oh, well, all those bad things." But at the time, uh,
because it had never been done before.
right, it
It
had never
really
been
had.
done. Yeah, it had never been done before, and so they were having to figure it out. And that's one of the things that I caution people about when they Amer- right now, a lot of Americans are shitting on themselves so badly over things that they had nothing to do with that we're weakening our culture and letting these other more homogenous cultures that are in opposition to us become stronger.
Well, and not only
And
that, what really infuriates me is that there are more slaves in Africa. than ever were at any time in the New World.
Yeah.
There were more slaves right now in India than there ever were at any time in the New World. And especially people that are coming from India over to America to lecture me on, hegemony in my history.
Yeah.
Clean up your country, end
Yeah.
slavery in India, end slavery in Africa. Then we'll have this discussion.
Yeah.
Until then, my history is actually something I should be proud of.
Yeah.
You know, all of my ancestors fought in the Civil War for the North. I
Yeah.
helped end slavery. I was one of the first nations in the world to end slavery. That is my heritage.
Yeah.
Your heritage is a continued heritage of slavery.
Well, and what a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, there's some early sins of America, or are there? Because when the South, and if you listen to Dinesh D'Souza, he'd blame it on the Democrats, but let's leave that for him to argue. When the South didn't, seceded and they were trying to do their slavery, and the North went down and conquered and burned the South. That part that used to be America that broke away, that was destroyed. And the northern part of America that never had slavery conquered and destroyed the South. And I would argue that our history of America, of modern America, is we destroyed the South, and we destroyed that sin that people are accusing us of.
Uh, but and then here's the thing: like, there's a great book anybody should read. It's called "Let the Glory Out: The South and Its Politics." And it's Gore Senior. He's going to effectively debunk the entire notion, what we consider the South to once be, and he does it primarily, with opinion polls from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and fairly factually, and he makes a solid evidentiary-based argument. So I think it would be nice for us to truly understand what that time
Yeah.
period was, but it's not what we look
Well,
at.
my understanding from talking to my friend from Arkansas, he said that back during the time of the Civil War, something like only 3% of the Southerners owned slaves, and the poor white, farmers who were having to compete against the slave owners' free labor, they hated slavery
It's
because,
true, absolutely. And one of the things that Al Gore Sr., one of the cruxes of his arguments is, if you look at especially opinion polling of rural farmers, they were like, I think 70-80% in favor of abolishing slavery.
yeah,
It was your urban population in Atlanta, your larger cities like Savannah, that were the ones that were pushing, for the continuance of slavery, and were the ones that were pushing for secession. And that's what people don't understand, is it was the rural South, largely with the North, on most of these issues. It was the urbanization, it was the urban centers, it was the economic centers
yeah.
that were very much for continuing the notion of what it was.
Well, it was it was
So,
the power elite. It was the 18th
and
or the 19th century equivalent to our modern billionaires.
and this isn't my opinion. This is our senior's
Yeah,
opinion. This is climate guru, what climate let's go climate this is the guy that we're thinking about taking our opinions. He's being held up, and being revered by Democrats, and this is an argument being made by us. So I
I,
mean,
I I think what's
I
really
want to
going
criticize the Democratic.
well. One of the things that I've always thought is that our modern politicians will alter history and create wedge issues because they want us normal people to fight each other over bullshit. Because if we're fighting over petty stuff that doesn't really matter, then we're too busy fighting to realize that we're all getting screwed by the same ruling elite. And this gets back to how there's not really much of a difference between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. They're the ruling elite. I largely think that they're willing to say or do whatever they have to in order to keep us divided over abortion and over racism and over any of this bullshit that not really many people care about. If they took a step back and realized, hey, we're all getting screwed. And I think that as the economy collapses, as people start realizing, hey, I need to eat, I need to heat my home, I need to pay for rent, I think that a lot of the petty, and I don't want to say petty because that demeans, these are legitimate issues that people have to argue out and figure out, but I think people are going to care a lot less about abortion when they're trying to feed themselves, and that's just the reality of the world. A lot of these other places don't have these debates, because if you're some poor starving person in Asia somewhere, or barely eking out a living in Russia or Africa or wherever, you don't have time to worry about these first world problems of, what bathroom do I use? You just, you're trying to survive. And I think that America has been so rich and so successful and so fat for so long that we've lost touch with what most people have to deal with on a daily basis.
Can't agree with you more, man.
So,
Absolutely.
well, I don't know how to pull out of this, and maybe we can do maybe we can do another segment. We've been going for about an hour now.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a long segment, and I have to get my dog.
yeah, so let's wrap it up here.
Okay.
But I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was going into this conversation, because I do think that reality is going to be a wake up call to America. I think we have everything that we need to rebuild our country. We just need the willpower to do it, and I think that when times become tough enough, I think that's going to wake up a lot of people.
I can't agree with you more, man. I mean, we gotta again. We're weak. We haven't been tested. We haven't tested ourselves. We don't know what we're capable of. And the people that we're listening to and letting us lead ourselves are people that don't have any steel in their spine.
Yeah,
And at some point, that's why I loved personally being in a war. That's why, for me, PTSD was coming home from it because I was in a place where I could survive based on my merit. I was on a place where the bad guys died and the good guys could kill them. And then I come back to a world where that's not the case. I see people that are succeeding not based on money, based on complete, immoral values. A person can be a horrible human being and succeed in our current society, and that's what truly causes me the internal pleasure and causes me the social dissonance that I cannot resolve. So at some point when things become bad, we are going the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is going to be inverted, and
yeah.
those people that have the steel in their spine, that have moral fire, that can get kicked in the gut 1,000 times and come back 1,001 times. That's the America that will resurface and show us. And I truly believe.
So here's I guess a final wrap up question. Right now, America, has its power spread and probably diluted all over the world. Are we going to try and maintain that, or do you think by necessity we're going to have to bring that back into America and internalize for a while? After World War One, we became very insular before World War Two happened. Do you think we're going to
So
remain a global presence, or are we going to turn inward and start ignoring the world?
I'm going to levy some criticisms, and this isn't toward the Democratic Party in general. It's toward Biden specifically, because most of my friends, even the hardcore Democrats, admit that he's not doing a good job. But if you look at Biden, he's acting as if he still has, the strength of America behind him, but he doesn't. And the world has figured that out. And that's what I see going forward. You can have a bunch of people thinking that we are still the America of 20 and 30 years ago and trying to project power to that, but it's just not going to work. So I see, at least in the near future, an America that's going to have to come to terms with the fact that we aren't what we once were, and it's going to take a hell of a lot of,
So you
elbow
don't you,
grease
you
to
don't
get
think that
back.
Ukraine's going to be a wake up call that
Oh, hell
America,
no. Americans are so deluded. The fact that
because
I
Afghanistan
knew
should have been a wake up call.
Afghanistan should have been a wake up call. Iraq should have been a wake up call. You know, there are so many wake up calls that we've ignored. Hell, 9/11 should have been a wake up call. A bunch of people hanging out in the middle of the desert were able to hijack 4 airliners and ram them into strategic targets in America. And we fought 2 wars and lost both of those wars. The last 20 years should be a massive wake up call.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the war on drugs should have been a wake up call. I mean, the Iranian Revolution should have been a wake up call. I mean, God, Vietnam should have been a wake up call. How many wake up calls do we need and we're not waking up? I mean, it's just going to get to the point where, we just got to get our teeth done. And, to the point, and things got to get bad. We
What will it
realize
take
we're
to
not
wake up? What will it take to wake up Americans? I mean,
starvation, actual starvation, death, actual death. I mean, honestly, that's what it'll take. I mean, we don't that yeah. I mean, right now there are so many, and again, it's what has been built up over previous generations. We have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid. People want to complain about our healthcare right now. Anybody that needs healthcare goes to Medicaid, and I mean, if America and our social services suck so much, we have millions of people lining up at our borders to get in. It doesn't suck. America's great, and we're gonna have to lose a lot of our greatness in order to really understand what we
So we might so we might have a much longer way to fall before we
Oh
pull
hell
out
yeah!
of this. Do you think?
I don't think people even we haven't even begun to see the bottom, and especially if you look at. I know we're trying to wrap it up. Let's compare America's economic. I think you absolutely can compare America's economy to Venezuela's economy circa 2000. You see what we're coming. These are people that are eating zoo animals. That's where we're going. Because the parallels are there. The debt to GDP ratio is there. The printing money is there. The leaders, you can absolutely compare which are. I mean,
You broke up there. You can absolutely compare what
you can absolutely compare Biden to Hugo Chavez.
to
So
Hugo Chavez?
yeah. So
Yeah.
and again, that's my final thought. We'll get there again because we have the strength of people. We have hearts. We have our genes. We have our parents. We have a ton of people that honestly yearn to breathe free. But there's a ton of people
But
here
you're
that
thinking
don't.
it might take a generation or two to circle back around.
I don't think it'll take a generation. It'll just take hardship. Because when hardship comes around, that's when strength shows.
So we could even turn around in a few years if we have
If
a
things get bad enough, but it's not going to turn around until.
perhaps the problem is we haven't had a shock to the system. We've had a sort of a slow and steady decline, but it's like the frog in the boiling water. If you turn it up slowly, the frog doesn't notice and jump out.
Yeah,
But if we have a major crash, maybe that'll wake it up.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, but
I guess we'll see.
my final thoughts are like I'm still optimistic long term for who we are. Everywhere I like, I'm in the middle of Portland's liberal city, and I'm seeing a black saying at the top of his as loud as he can. He's dressed all in dang. He looks like, you know, everything is stereotype in Alabama. I think person. And this is what this guy is saying, and I'm going to quote him a little bit. He said, "This shit with China wouldn't be happening if Trump were in charge." He's like, "I don't care what all you people say. You know, Ukraine didn't happen when Trump was there. We're looking. China's right across the ocean. They're about to take over Taiwan. They're about to get on the border. This wouldn't be happening if Trump's in charge." We have that people, and then not just among white people. It's among black people. It's from everybody that wants to be. That's still there, and that's not going to change. But the question is, the circumstances surrounding it. And my greatest reason for optimism is what the American people. I just don't know that right now in the situation where the strength is going to show itself. But I'm still
Well,
optimistic.
and I think it would be a I think the mistake that the Republicans made uh, was that they relied on somebody like Trump to to lead us out when the reality is a single strong leader won't do it. You need the people as a whole to to kind of sort themselves out and take care of their communities. And the caution that I would give Republicans, the Democrats turned to Biden to get us out of this mess and he made it worse. And I think that the Republicans turning to Trump, um, they're going to be disappointed also. I think that they need to solve their own. When America tanks, when the economy tanks, it's going to be the local communities that have to be built up that hold together. Not some. It's going to be a bottom up approach, not a top down approach.
Couldn't
And
agree more, man.
and I think that Americans in both parties need to start taking that mindset that we need to build up our local communities and rebuild the country from the bottom up rather than looking for some leader to save us. And
Absolutely.
and on that note, I'm going to wish everyone a good night, and I will see everyone next time. And let's continue this conversation again, okay?
Good stuff.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot, Gator. Thanks for coming. Good night,
Yeah,
everyone.
and okay, yeah, sorry.
No, you can finish.
Yeah, no, this isn't for the taping thing. whenever you need to edit out, because I know we went
Oh well,
way.
that's okay. Let me wrap it up then. I'll say good night, and then you can give me your private comments afterwards. Good night, everyone.